Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country to present their research and engage in the discussion with the NDSU community. Topics focus on opportunity, innovation, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. And I'm really excited that today we're joined by Dr. Daniel Bennett from Louisville. He's going to talk about the impact of populism on entrepreneurship. So Dr. Daniel Bennett is an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at the Center for Free Enterprise at the University of Louisville. His research expertise is in economic development and entrepreneurial ecosystems. He previously worked as a research professor at Baylor University in the Department of Entrepreneurship. He received his PhD in economics from Florida State University. And after Dr. Bennett gives his presentation, there will be about 15 minutes that you can ask your own questions of Dr. Bennett. And please submit your questions at any time in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and Clay Rutledge will moderate the Q&A session. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Dr. Daniel Bennett, and thanks for coming, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, John. I appreciate the invitation, the opportunity to come out to speak to the students today about some of my work. I also want to thank Callie and Clay for helping out with all the logistics. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen so that everybody can see my slides and kind of follow along here. All right. Clay, give me a thumbs up if they. All right, great. So I know this is the Human Flourishing lecture series. I'm going to be talking about the effects of populism on entrepreneurship today. So this may be maybe spin this as a potential barrier to flourishing, because we know that entrepreneurship is kind of one of the driving forces of human flourishing. Leads to improvements in our living standards, gives us new and exciting goods and products, and just contributes to the overall well-being of individuals and societies. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the effects of populism on entrepreneurship. All right, so just to give you a little bit of background, why do we care? There's a growing influence of populism in politics around the world. This chart here plots for a sample of 60 independent democratic nations, the share that have had populist regimes over time. So it goes out to 2018. In this most recent year, we see that about more than 25%, or one out of four democratic countries, had a populist regime in power, and this is the highest level we've seen for this group of countries, really over the past century, and so we really do see kind of we're in a current wave of populism. All right, so there's a large body of research in the political science literature, as you might expect. Most of this literature is looking at kind of the causes of populism, trying to define what it is. There's been some studies on the kind of macroeconomic consequences of populism. A lot of that literature has found negative macroeconomic consequences. One limitation of that literature is it's largely looking at kind of left-wing populism in South America. And as we know, we're seeing the emergence of a lot of different types of populism across the ideological spectrum. And we're now seeing this in the emergence of populist leaders in Western countries, in Europe, and even in the United States. And so we really know very little about the microeconomic effects of populism. So business scholars have just started to think about how populism may affect businesses, and that's kind of where this study with my co-authors, Boris Nikolaev at Baylor University and Christopher Boudreau at Florida Atlantic University, come in to try to make a contribution here. So the question we're trying to ask in this research is, how does populist discourse by a nation's political leader influence individual decisions to pursue opportunity-motivated entrepreneurship? I've just got some pictures here of some politicians who have been described as populist here. You've got Evo Morales from Bolivia, Hugo Chavez from Venezuela, our former president, Donald Trump, and then we've got Recep Erdogan from Turkey, just a few kind of famous populists that you might be familiar with. All right, so all good research talks should, talk about what the research question is and summarize their findings before they kind of get into the theory and the data. So just to kind of give you a summary of the findings, we find that the effect of populism on entrepreneurship really depends on the context. So we find that populism is worse for entrepreneurship in nations that have stronger political institutions. And as I'll tell you shortly, this is kind of the opposite of what we kind of theorized, and I'll get into that a little bit further. We also find that there are different varieties of populism that typically fall on kind of the left versus right political spectrum, and we find that left-wing populism is much more adverse for entrepreneurship than right-wing or even centrist populism. Okay. So before kind of getting into some of the theory and the data, it's important to understand what is populism. I'm sure that everybody's heard the term populist, and it's been used to describe a variety of different regimes, different politicians, different policies, and really the concept's been used to describe a wide range of socio-political phenomena and oftentimes contradictory political ideologies. Political scientist Whalen described it as a shifty concept that's used to describe a wide variety of governments, parties, movements, leaders, and policies. So there's generally a lack of a generally accepted definition, but the literature's kind of converged upon 4 different approaches. I'll briefly summarize those, but I really just want to focus on the kind of the approach that we're using in this paper because it lends itself to the study and the comparative analysis that we're trying to do. So first is the economic approach, and really the focus here is on kind of myopic economic policies, and it's really focused on large scale redistribution, inflationary kind of monetary and fiscal policy, and this is largely associated with left-wing populism in Latin America. And so, as you might think, that it makes it difficult to study other types of populism. It also makes it difficult to assess the effects of populism on economic outcomes of interest from the actual policy environment. There's also the political strategic approach, which is some strategy on the part of the politician to kind of mobilize a group. And again, this approach doesn't work for us because it's largely defined based on the actions of the political leader. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we are able to assess the effects of populism as distinct from the effects of kind of institutional or policy actions. And then there's also a sociocultural approach, which is, basically characterized by these low appeals that resonate and receive positive receptions with particular sectors of society for sociocultural historical reasons. So appeals to, say, the poor or historically underrepresented minorities, et cetera. The approach we're going to use kind of falls in the ideational definition, and this is defined as a thin-centered ideology that's often attached to a thick ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into 2 homogeneous and antagonistic groups. You've got the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and it also argues that politics are an expression of the general will of the people. So these are kind of the two general characteristics of this approach. Is you've got 2 groups, the people versus the the enemy, the corrupt elite, and then you also have the people's will is being manifest in the populist leader who's representing them. Okay. So within this ideational approach, one kind of definition that is becoming increasingly utilized by political scientists as well as scholars outside of political science that are looking at populism is what's known as the discursive definition of populism, which views populism as a set of ideas expressed by political leaders that make moral distinction between things that are good versus those that are evil. Okay, the things that are good are manifested by the will of the people through their election of their populist leader, and the populist leader represents this people. All right. Things that are evil are those that subvert the will of the people and are a result of the common enemy of the so-called conspiring elites. Now, who these conspiring elites are, this can vary, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, it's important to recognize in the definition that the use of the word "the people" does not represent all people living in a society. It doesn't represent all citizens. It's actually an empty signifier that allows the populace to appeal to different constituent groups to create a shared identity and a common cause. Now, this group of the people may exclude specific groups whose rights or interests may be deemed as undermining the will of the people. Okay, so groups that might be excluded, most often the incumbent political class, the so-called political establishment is often considered part of the enemy group, but also it could be, foreigners, minorities, it could be the media, it could be, business leaders or the business class or entrepreneurs. So it really depends on the particular variety of populist as to who the enemy group is that's kind of undermining the will of the people. All right, and so this, with this definition, the kind of enemy group, this evil minority, ceases to have legitimacy, citizenship, or possibly human rights because it has chosen to fight against the common good, right? So if this all sounds kind of ridiculous, it is. All right, so another aspect of populism is there's often calls for some form of liberation or revolution that's necessary to achieve the will of the people and subvert the existing order, suppressing it. One of the top kind of populist scholars, Kurt Hawkins, describes it this way: the old system has been taken over by the forces of evil and no longer serves the people. This conflict is not over particular policies or issues, but institutions and the system. These must be reshaped or at least substantially modified. If not, the forces of evil will regroup and continue their oppression. Another kind of quote from the literature from Davini and Hartwell says, populism is perpetuated a way to erode or change existing institutional structures from within, using the levers of democracy to forever alter its composition and shape, right? So, populists will use language that there's some sort of revolution that needs to take place or liberation in order to kind of achieve the will of the people. One of the most famous populists of our time, Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, upon his reelection, famously declared, "Another era will begin, another revolutionary era." And actually, there's his kind of political regime is kind of characterized as the Bolivarian Revolution, and there's actually, I got posted here a book written about it. So definitely using this kind of revolutionary type of language. All right. So our argument is that these calls for revolution or institutional upheaval creates regime uncertainty. All right. So to give you some background about why this might matter, entrepreneurship will thrive when entrepreneurs trust that society holds values that are beneficial to business and property rights. All right, so basically more economic freedom gives entrepreneurs the incentive, lowers their transaction costs, reduces their uncertainty of exchange, which leads to more entrepreneurial activity. Indeed, there's a robust number of empirical studies that find this positive link between economic freedom and different types of entrepreneurial activity. Okay. However, the emergence of a populist regime can initiate the breakdown of this trust in kind of the market institutions. So with the populace calling for institutional upheavals or revolutions, this may signal to entrepreneurs that there's an ideological shift underway that no longer respects market supporting institutions such as property rights, the rule of law, contract and even-handed contract enforcement, free trade, etc. All right, so our argument is that this creates regime uncertainty, which is defined as a pervasive lack of confidence among investors and entrepreneurs in their ability to foresee the extent to which future government actions will continue to protect their property rights and also support business and market exchange. They rely on these institutions to kind of reduce the uncertainty in the environment. And when they perceive that the future institutions will no longer continue to protect those rights, well, it creates uncertainty, which will cause them to distort their entrepreneurial process. So there's some evidence that actually populism is linked to reductions in economic freedom. So it's not just blind kind of perceptions or that some future actions. There is actually some evidence that populism does lead to a reduction in market supporting institutions. All right, so our argument in the paper is that regime uncertainty is created by populist discourse that undermines trust among entrepreneurs concerning the future stability of market supporting institutions. All right, so this creates the perception of institutional instability, which can make it predictions about the future conditions of markets unreliable or altogether impossible, right? If you can't, if you're planning a business and you need to make some projections about, your future profit and loss, conditions, and if you don't know what your costs are going to be, or whether your contracts are going to continue to be enforced, or whether your property is potentially going to be abrogated, then it makes these calculations very, very difficult, and so that may deter entrepreneurs. It's going to raise the transaction cost that they anticipate facing in the future, and distort their entrepreneurial process, and potentially dissuade entrepreneurs from taking any action, or potentially at least temporarily delaying until they figure out how the policy environment is going to shape up. All right, so this leads to our first testable hypothesis, which is that populist discourse is negatively associated with entrepreneurship. All right, so we're not going to stop there. We're going to look at potential moderating effects. As I mentioned in my summary of findings, the context, we do find the context matters. So one thing we're going to look at is the quality of political institutions in a country. All right, so our argument is regime uncertainty arises when entrepreneurs perceive that a populist discourse is going to signal that there's forthcoming institutional changes. However, this threat has to be a credible one for them to for an entrepreneur to stop and pause their actions and think about the potential future, right? If they don't believe that the populist is going to be able to engage in a revolution or institutional upheaval, then they may not it may not affect their decision making. All right, so the feasibility for a populist to enact such changes may actually be constrained in nations that have stronger political checks and balances in place that limit the power or the authority or the decision making of the populist leader, right? So political institutions can encourage greater government accountability, and they can limit the ability of politicians to kind of rule by fiat or iron fist hand, and they can and extract resources from individuals or organizations, right? So in this way, the checks and balances or the political institutions may serve as institutional guardrails that may provide entrepreneurs greater confidence in the future stability of institutions. So this leads to our second hypothesis, which is that the strength of checks and balances of the political system of a country weakens the negative effect of populist discourse on entrepreneurship. In other words, the negative effect of populist discourse on entrepreneurship will be stronger in countries that have weaker institutional checks and balances, but it will be weaker in countries that have stronger political checks and balances. At least that's what we theorize. as I'll mention when I get to the results, we actually find the opposite. So we'll have to talk a little bit about that. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is, does the variety of populism matter? So we're going to look at the role of political ideology. So as I mentioned in my definition, populism is a thin-centered ideology. However, it rarely travels alone. It typically attaches itself to another thick ideology in order to promote political objectives and reforms that have much broader appeal. All right, so the variety populism is typically influenced largely by the host ideology. And in practice, what we see is that populists typically either take kind of a right-wing bent or a left-wing bent. Right-wing populisms typically gravitate towards some mix or combination of nationalism and neoliberalism, and I'll talk a little bit about what those mean on the next slide. Whereas left-wing populists tend to associate more with socialism, okay? And I'll talk about that shortly. So what we theorize in the paper is that populism's effect on entrepreneurship is conditional on the host ideology. So whether it's right-wing, left-wing, or potentially centrist, there is potential for centrist populism, which, kind of often has a mix of kind of contradictory policy and ideological proposals. So you have these different varieties, and we're going to look at whether the variety of populism matters for the entrepreneurial outcomes. So let me first talk about right-wing populism. As I mentioned, is typically attached to some combination of nationalistic or neoliberal ideology. All right, so if you're unfamiliar with those terms, here's the bird's eye view. Nationalism, typically focuses on the domestic economy and people, and it may portray kind of foreigners or immigrants as potential adversary or something to be kind of mitigated, right? So with this side of this type of populism, you might get the leader advancing something like immigration restrictions, right? So you want to limit the number of immigrants. They may be destroying culture, maybe the message, or they may be taking our jobs, etc. You may also see some restrictions on kind of global trade or free trade, right, in order to try and quote unquote protect the domestic economy. This is quite common. And so with these sort of policy or institutional changes for an entrepreneur, this is going to kind of raise the level of uncertainty and the transaction costs that they kind of anticipate in the future. If you're an entrepreneur, you may be thinking about buying products that you use in your production process from foreign suppliers, and if there's going to be tariffs and other sorts of import quotas, well, your costs are probably going to be higher, right? And so potentially can lead to an increase in your cost. Now, the other thing that right-wing populism often attaches to is neoliberalism. All right, so I'm not a big fan of this word, but doesn't seem to be grounded in any kind of clear, concise, widely agreed upon kind of conceptual framework, but it's often used basically to describe pro-market institutional reforms that reduce government intervention in the economy. All right, so we'll take that definition as an assumption. So this may include things like reducing taxes, lowering kind of regulations, privatizing certain government operations, etc. All right, so these sort of policy actions would actually lower uncertainty in transactions costs that entrepreneurs face. All right, so here we have this kind of mixed bag of goods, right-wing populist, kind of raising uncertainty by taking a nationalistic view, but also potentially lowering it by, attaching to neoliberal policies. But overall, we think that probably, right-wing populists are going to create some uncertainty about the institutional environment. So overall, we kind of expect there to be still a negative relationship, although as I'll get to shortly, we actually find some evidence that it's positively associated with entrepreneurial activity. All right, so just to kind of give you an example of what this a right-wing populist might look like. Donald Trump's been, our former president's been widely described as a populist. Some of his campaign mantras, like "drain the swamp," was, had some populist element to it. Raging against the, kind of the incumbent political establishment was the idea there. Also railed about the media. And the mantra of make America great again was also had some populist element to it. But his whole presidency, or his campaign had elements of populism, but also you could see that it was kind of attached to kind of a nationalistic view, but also to a neoliberal view. So Trump said kind of raised some protectionist measures, particularly against China. So, on the campaign trail, he's quoted as saying, "We can't continue to allow China to rape our country. We must stand up to China on our terrible trade agreements and protect every last American job," right here. So here he's kind of portraying China as the enemy that's undermining kind of the rights and the interest of the American worker. He was also kind of a bit anti-immigration. Everybody knows this, build a wall on the southern border. On the campaign trail, he said he was going to build a great wall and that Mexico was going to pay for that wall. All right, so here he's taking somewhat of an anti-immigrant stance, an anti-foreigner stance. But also elements of kind of neoliberalism in his kind of ideological bag. On the campaign trail, he said, on taxes, we're going to massively cut tax rates for workers and small businesses. We're going to get rid of regulations. We're going to make it easier for young Americans to get the credit they need to start a small business and pursue their dream. Okay, so we see this kind of confluence of kind of policies, some of them, being more in kind of the nationalistic kind of viewpoint, but then also these kind of neoliberal elements of his discourse. All right, so that's right-wing populism. There's also left-wing populism. As I mentioned earlier, left-wing populists typically kind of attached to socialism in order to kind of advance the definition of the people that embraces the socio-economic underdog, right? So appealing to kind of the lower classes with an emphasis on redistribution to certain groups, but also coupled with harsh anti-capitalistic rhetoric. Here I have a picture and famous quote of Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia, railing against capitalism, said the worst enemy of humanity is capitalism. This is what provokes uprising like our own, a rebellion against a system, against a neoliberal model, which is the representation of a savage capitalism. If the entire world doesn't acknowledge this reality, that the national states are not providing even minimally for health, education, and nourishment, then each day the most fundamental human rights are being violated. Okay, so here he is kind of railing against capitalism and kind of trying to appeal to like the certain class of people that he says need the government to help him with certain aspects of life. All right, so this sort of populism, this sort of discourse signals the potential replacement of market supporting institutions with greater government control over economic allocation. And we argue this creates significant regime uncertainty for entrepreneurs in a culture that may shun entrepreneurship. Okay, so to give you an example of that, Hugo Chavez, the former president of Venezuela, when he came into power, he was a fierce opponent of capitalism. Here's a quote that he gave: "Capitalism is actually the way of the devil and exploitation." Here he's creating the enemy here is capitalism. If you really want to look at things through the eyes of Jesus Christ, who I think was the first socialist, only socialism can really create a genuine society. So here, highly populist elements in his talk. And the kind of effects of kind of this populist regime have really been devastating on Venezuela. So it's kind of exemplified by some words from Oscar Garcia Mendoza, who was a former president and CEO of a major financial institution in Venezuela, an outspoken critic of Chavez and populism in that country. He said, "The nation has been looted. Almost all the legal system has been raised, and a volcanic deluge of laws, decrees, regulations, and other legal instruments was unleashed for the purpose of destroying everything in the private sector and communizing the nation, hindering and preventing development or entrepreneurial activity." All right, so I'm going to show you a short 2-minute video. And this is a video of the bread lines in Venezuela. So this just kind of illustrates some of the consequences of left-wing populism in this country. So. Can you hear the video? Okay, so I am not having any luck with the volume, but I guess we get the basic picture here that from at least seeing a hint of the video that people were lined up and queued in Venezuela for basic goods, for bread, for toilet paper. These things are being rationed by the government, because it's become illegal for businesses to sell many of the essential goods in the country. And so for time's sake, I'll just kind of move on, but I think that gives us a picture of what's happened. All right, but we need not go to South America to get an example of left-wing populism. Former famous U.S. Senator, long-term Senator Bernie Sanders, and actually former frontrunner of the Democratic Party candidate Bernie Sanders exhibits quite a bit of populism in his discourse. He wrote a book called Our Revolution. So here, calling for a revolution. And here's a couple of quotes from Sanders saying, "My campaign is about a political revolution, millions of people standing up and saying enough is enough. Our government belongs to us and not just a handful of billionaires." All right, so here kind of casting, the business class as the enemy. Here again, he says, "Let us wage a moral and political war against the billionaires and corporate leaders on Wall Street and elsewhere, whose policies and greeds are destroying the middle class of America." Here, the people were obviously the middle and lower income class, and the enemy or the corrupt elite, or the entrepreneurs, the business leaders, the CEO, who were kind of engaged in some corrupt development of policies that favor the rich at the expense of the poor, right? So that's his basic message, highly, pretty populist in tone. So to give you a sense of how entrepreneurs might kind of view this sort of speech, Bernie Marcus, who is one of the co-founders of Home Depot, in an interview said that Bernie Sanders is the enemy of every entrepreneur that's ever going to be born in this country and has been born in the past. So here Bernie Marcus is using a little bit of populist language by referring to this politician as an enemy, but generally reflecting that his type of populism is not going to be good for entrepreneurs. Okay. All right. So what does all this mean is that the type of populism we think matters for its effect on entrepreneurship. So we have a set of hypotheses. Basically, we think that left-wing political leaders, their effect on entrepreneurship will be more negative relative to centrist political leaders. We think the same of right-wing populists, that relative to centrists, the negative effects will be greater. And we also predict that the right-wing populists, the effects of their discourse on entrepreneurship will be less negative than that of left-wing political leaders. So that's what we kind of theorized, and I'll tell you what we find here shortly. I'm in a management department. I publish in management journals. We like figures that are very basic to illustrate our theories. So here we call this our model. All right, so here our baseline hypothesis is that populist discourse will have a negative relationship with opportunity motivated entrepreneurship. That's that straight line here from populism to entrepreneurship. But this negative effect will be weakened in nations with stronger political checks and balances. That's the arrow from the bottom pointing in up. That's H2. And then we also predict that we'll see some moderating effects based upon the ideology of the populist. And here we see that we predict that the left and right wing populist will have a greater negative effect on entrepreneurs than centrist, but also that right wing populist will have a less negative effect than left wing populist. All right, so those are our predictions. Let me talk a little bit about our data and our model. Okay, so we're going to use data from numerous sources to create a multi-level data set. All right, so what this means is that we have countries and individuals. So we have more than 780,000 individuals in our data set, spanning 33 mostly high and middle income democratic nations that are largely located in Latin America and Europe. So this represents 83 different political leaders, either the president or the prime minister. Our data span the years 2002 to 2016. And we're going to use what's known as mixed effects logistic regression, which is a type of hierarchical linear model to account for country level effects on individual behavior. Okay. So where do we get our data? What are we measuring? Okay, so the dependent variable, which is the outcome we're interested in, is opportunity motivated entrepreneurship. We get this data from what's called the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, which is a very collaborative global effort to get at entrepreneurial activity in a consistent way across countries. So this is a large-scale survey conducted in lots of different countries, asking the same sorts of questions. And what we're interested in is the individual's decision to become an entrepreneur that's motivated by some sort of perceived market opportunity. So for all the individuals in our 780,000 individuals in our data set, we know whether they have decided recently to become entrepreneurs by the motivation for a market opportunity. Okay, and so this is a binary variable that takes a value of 0 or 1 if they're an opportunity motivated entrepreneur, and 0 if not. Okay, so the main independent variable that we're interested in is the populist discourse of the political leader. All right, so this comes from the global populism data set created by Kirk Hopkins and a team of political scientists to try and measure the extent of populist discourse for a large number of political leaders across countries and time. And what they do is they rate the speeches for different elements of populism in the speech, and they rate 4 different speeches for each leader. One is the campaign speech, another is a famous speech. So this, like in the United States, might be something like the State of the Union address. There's also a ribbon cutting speech that might be to unveil some new project or something like that. And then there's also a foreign speech, which might be a talk given to like the United Nations or something like that. All right. And so these speeches are all rated by numerous experts and rated from a scale of 0 to 2, 0 being like not populist at all, 1 being some elements of populist, 2 being extremely populist. And then they take the average over these various speeches and give you an overall score. Okay, so we're also interested in a couple of moderating variables. As I mentioned, we look at the political checks and balances. So we use this index of political checks and balances from the varieties of democracy data set. And this assesses checks and balances across multiple dimensions, one being kind of what's called vertical accountability. So are there free and fair elections? Another being horizontal accountability. So is there kind of checks and balances across different sectors of the government. So, do you have an executive that's separated from the legislative branch so that there's some sort of balances? And then also what's called diagonal. So this is, the extent to which civil society and the media can kind of hold politicians accountable. All right, so that's what we're going to use there. And then we also code each leader in our data set, their political ideology, whether it's more aligned with left-wing, right-wing, or a centrist ideology. All right, and then we're going to control for a bunch of things, a bunch of individual characteristics, demographics, education, income, various socio-cognitive traits that have been linked to entrepreneurial behavior, as well as a number of country-level factors, numerous measures of culture, several different measures of macroeconomic uncertainty, control for the level of economic freedom. And these are important controls because we're really trying to assess the effect of the populist discourse on the individual's decision to become an entrepreneur. So it's important to control for other potential sources of uncertainty as well as the policy environment. And then we're going to control for, the level of GDP of a country, its population, whether the country belongs to the EU, which as kind of a macro institution may influence the environment, as well as how long the leader's been in office. All right, so controlling for a whole bunch of things that potentially are important. All right, so our baseline results are, I'm not going to show you any regression coefficients or standard errors, so I'm just going to talk about the results, and I'll show you a couple of pictures to illustrate what we came up with. Consistent with our baseline hypothesis, we do observe a negative relationship between populist discourse and individual decision to become an opportunity-motivated entrepreneur. We estimate what's called an odds ratio, and what we observe there is that a 2% or a 1 unit increase in populist discourse is associated with a 2% reduction in the probability that the average individual becomes an entrepreneur in our data set. However, this result is estimated pretty imprecisely, meaning it's not statistically significant. All right. So overall, our baseline hypothesis is not supported. That populist discourse by itself does not have any discernible effect on entrepreneurship. However, when we kind of look at the moderating effect of political checks and balances, we find pretty significant results. All right, and so what this graph shows on the x-axis is the political checks and balances, ranging from -2, which is very weak, to +2, which is very strong. What we see is, in very weak political institutional environments, that the effect of populism on the probability of becoming an entrepreneur is actually positive, but this is weakening as the level of checks and balances goes up, and it even turns negative at very high levels, above a score of about 1.5. That becomes negative. And interestingly, about 3/4 of the population in our sample live in countries that are above this threshold of like 1.5. So in most countries in our sample, the effect of populism on entrepreneurship is effectively negative. All right. So that kind of contradicts our second hypothesis. All right, and then lastly, I'll talk about the effects of ideology, how it plays a role. All right, and so this chart shows the kind of the effect by level of populist discourse on the x-axis, and then the probability of an individual becoming an entrepreneur on the y-axis, and then different lines represent the effects for the different ideologies of the politician. All right, so the downward sloping line is for left-wing populists. So we see that, as the left-wing politicians become more populist, the effect on entrepreneurship becomes increasingly negative. However, we observe the opposite for right-wing and center populists. As right-wing and center politicians become more populist, the effects on entrepreneurship actually become slightly more positive. At higher levels of populism, the difference between center and right is statistically indistinguishable, meaning there's not much difference, in the effects of populism on entrepreneurship between center and right. However, both center and right populist have a much more positive effect on entrepreneurship than do left-wing politicians. So this kind of supports partially supports our third hypothesis, particularly parts A and C. All right. So just to summarize my findings, populism's effect on entrepreneurship depends on the context. It's worse for entrepreneurship in nations with stronger political institutions. And left-wing populism is more adverse for entrepreneurship than right-wing or centrist populism. So that's the end of my talk. I think we're about right on time. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or comments.
Okay. Can you? Do
you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe stop sharing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. That was really fascinating. So I'll get us stopping or get us started while we're waiting to see if we get any questions in the Q&A. So maybe this isn't a very clear question, but I was wondering if you could maybe just talk a bit more about this distinction that you're this contradiction perhaps or conflict on the right between, on the one hand, like a protectionist sort of anti-free trade, anti-globalism rhetoric that you see, but at the same time like a very like pro business thinking. I was wondering if you think that how that might influence entrepreneurs at different levels. So what I mean by that is some of the quotes you had criticizing populism were like big corporate CEOs, right? And so a lot of entrepreneurs are just like trying to set up a little coffee shop or restaurant or, run kind of a local business. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on different types of entrepreneurs and how they may react to that type of rhetoric, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Clay, and that's something we've kind of thought about and toyed with in different versions of the paper. And I think probably populism, right-wing's populism's effect on entrepreneurship kind of depends on how globally oriented the firm is, right? So, if you're really relying on exports and getting supplies from foreigners or even investment, right? So you're going to be more affected by this sort of protectionist or type of rhetoric. Whereas, if you're a more domestically oriented entrepreneur, you may actually benefit from protectionism because, okay, you don't face as much competition from foreign firms or larger firms. It becomes more costly for them to operate in your home country, and so that may actually provide, make you more competitive relative than you would otherwise. So I certainly think that one of the limitations of our work right now is that we're unable to differentiate between these sort of different types of entrepreneurs. All we know is if someone started a business that's based on, a perceived market opportunity. But that perceived market opportunity could be very local. Like you said, it could be, oh, my town needs a new coffee shop, right? That's an opportunity motivated entrepreneur. And some of the follow-up work that I've started doing, we're looking at incumbent, like small and medium enterprises and whether they are engaging in what we call productive or unproductive entrepreneurship. And so in that preliminary results, what we're finding is that right-wing populism tends to be associated with less productive entrepreneurship by these firms, meaning that they kind of produce new or innovative products or services. But it seems to be positively associated with unproductive entrepreneurship. And this is kind of consistent with the idea that maybe the pro-business populism encourages rent seeking. So I'll kind of stop talking there just to make sure we get other questions. But I do think that's an important part of the story, and it's probably the next steps in our research project is trying to better understand that.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Okay, so yeah, we do. So We have some questions in the Q&A here. So, how do we identify populist regimes? Is there a framework for that? Because I believe that the majority of national politics is separated into right and left-wing ideologies that are used to achieve political power, with some being bold but extreme and others being subtle and also extreme. So yeah, I guess it's kind of how to identify.
Yeah, so I think the key elements to look for are they calling for some sort of like revolution or institutional upheaval? All right, like Bernie Sanders, like he wrote a book called Our Revolution. All right, so that's a pretty strong signal that he's a populist. Another thing is, are they kind of setting up this dichotomy about, there's a group of people that are good and there's a group of people that are bad, and using this sort of language of, good versus bad or evil versus good, invoking kind of, moral arguments about, why one group of people are bad, one people are good, right? So that those are kind of the tall tale kind of defining features of populists, and just be careful listening for that and as politicians talk.
Yeah, no, excellent point. So another question here we have from John, I think, is the effect of populism on entrepreneurship worse when institutions are stronger? Because in countries with weak institutions, there is strong uncertainty anyway. In other words, the effects of populism doesn't matter as much because a lack of institutions already creates uncertainty.
That's a great question. That's something we've been deliberating on and pondering ourselves. And so I think there's probably something to it, that institutions in countries with weaker institutions already don't do a good job of, say, securing property rights or enforcing contracts or making kind of these sort of reductions in uncertainty that we think about good institutions as doing. Maybe they're not already operating very well, and so populists coming along saying they're going to change that doesn't affect the entrepreneurs' decision framework very much, because they're already used to dealing with this sort of institutional uncertainty. Or it may not be uncertain, it may be pretty certain, but it's just not, like, they're just not good institutions to begin with. And so maybe that's part of the story. Another thing is, I think in countries that do have stronger institutions, probably the business owners, the entrepreneurs, are more aware of the importance of the institutions for what they do, and come to rely on, impartial courts and property rights protections. And when you get a politician who comes along, starts talking about, upending that system, then of course that's gonna create a lot of uncertainty, because they're very much aware that these things are important. So.
Yeah, when you were during your presentation, I was actually thinking about that institutional uncertainty issue, and I was wondering, like, you can imagine different countries in which institutional certainty is bad because the institutions are anti-business, or and so do you think there's context in which the history matters, like if the uncertainty is actually a potential opening for economic freedom versus a society like the US, where maybe the established institution is good for business, but then the uncertainty might be bad for business, versus the reverse? Does that make sense? Or is uncertainty always bad?
Well, so I mean, I think that entrepreneurs, I'm still like coming to understand all of this, right? So I'm reading a book right now on it's called Capitalism Without Democracy, and it's about China. And just how how Chinese entrepreneurs in the post-reform era have basically created a lot of new wealth in that country, even without a strong institutional background. And so I think entrepreneurs figure out ways to do things, but maybe there's limits on their growth and kind of the economies of scale that can be achieved without without a good set of institutions. So, I mean, I think in those weaker institutional settings, you talk about like connections to the politicians and the political class are very important, right, for your success, right? So politicians can arbitrarily come and impose regulations on you or ask for bribes and stuff like that. And so like you just kind of have to be connected in those worlds, and that's how business works. And so I guess to answer your question, there's uncertainty, but like that uncertainty, I think, is kind of mitigated through political strategy of the businesses. And so I don't know, it's just it's very complicated and something we, like, the scholar community is trying to better understand, but don't think we have a full grasp on it. But I certainly think there's that's something I'll be working on in the future more, is trying to understand that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, since we're almost out of time, I'm going to give you one last question about that, kind of do you have a take home? So, we're about human flourishing, right? And do you have any kind of take home positive silver lining or positive message, encouraging message, or future directions even that you would think would be like ways to advance, ways to enhance entrepreneurship or business dynamism?
I mean, I think the answer is more economic freedom. I've done a lot of other research finding positive links between economic freedom, not just at the national level, but also at the local level. And I think this is where a lot of, students and, even other faculty, university faculty, researchers can potentially have more of an influence, is, at your local and state level, getting involved in advancing kind of pro-free market policies. So even if you can't control what happens at the national level, I mean, to some extent, your vote may, who you support politically for president. I would try not to support populist. Sometimes you're given a choice between a left-wing and a right-wing populist. I don't know, my evidence suggests vote for the right-wing populist, but, to support more entrepreneurship. I think populism overall is not good, not a good direction forward. It's undermines a lot of the good institutions that we have in a liberal democracy. But, just more economic freedom, and we can achieve that even at the local level.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think oftentimes we get focused on these really, really big things, and obviously we should care about that. But yeah, sometimes the most direct and significant action we can take is, right outside of our own door. So thank you so much for presenting your research here with us today. We wish we could have had you in person, but we're thankful for innovations in technology that allow us to go forward even remotely. You can't hear the audience clapping, but we are all clapping at home. And thanks again, Daniel.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.